And a very good evening to you. Could we just ask those that are out in the back, if you'd like to come into the main hall now, and we'll start in another minute or so. That's great. Well, a very warm welcome to you. I'm Peter Brown. I'm one of the members here at Lansdowne, and welcome to Lansdowne at Woodbury Avenue. Again, it's a slightly different format. We hold this once a month, the Big Questions evening. This is the 7th one in our series, and Micheal Ots will speak tonight on the very important topic, isn't the Bible a fabricated fairy tale? And a question that many of us receive from work colleagues, friends, etc. So hopefully tonight Micheal will be able to unblock some of those questions and queries that we may have. Just the format for the evening, Michael's going to speak for around half an hour, and we'll have a short break after that. We'll have questions. Questions can be asked on the screen. We'll have a number up, a mobile number. You can text your questions to Micheal through that number. You've got feedback forms on your chairs. Please do, if you've got a question, just pop it on there and the stewards will pick that up from you. And we'll also have a roving mic, so we'll interchange between text questions, feedback questions and the roving mic to make it more interesting. So any questions that suddenly come to you that you think, yeah, I need to ask this in an open setting, then please do. We've got a number of questions on the board, and which people have put on the board since they've come in. Some of the key ones that we have here, what the Bible is, and people have commented, the Bible is life-changing, problematic, inspiring, complete fabrication, hard to read, God's Word, lots of rules. That's one that we often hear, isn't it? And the story of Jesus. So the Bible actually provokes quite a lot of comment and debate, and hopefully tonight we can actually take that a little bit further. So Micheal, come on up. And we did the last Big Questions, 20th of March.
Yep.
So a month later,
Yep.
Just give us a brief summary of what you've done. You've travelled quite intensely, haven't you, over the last 4 weeks?
Yes, the last couple of weeks. I was in Belarus a couple of weeks ago, speaking at a week of events organised in Minsk, the capital city there. And that was a really exciting week. We had big numbers of people coming in to the events, people really engaging, and it was the first time they'd ever done anything like it in the city. And then last week I was in Moldova, just tucked between Romania and Ukraine. And again, similar kind of week of events in the city called Belts in the north of Moldova.
So an interesting thing you said to me before when we were chatting beforehand, you said in those countries, a lot of them were very much atheistic countries. Mm-hmm. And they've come through. They almost regard atheism as their past.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I hear a lot of times here in Western Europe people saying kind of we're post-Christian, we've left Christianity behind, and it's kind of very much that was our past and we need to get beyond it. But of course, in the Soviet Union and in that part of the world, communism really pressed the atheistic agenda quite strongly. And so the attitude, particularly of a younger generation, is very much atheism was our past, and we saw that didn't work, so we're kind of interested to see what else might be out there. They're skeptical about institutionalized religion and what they've seen maybe of the church in their culture, but they're hungry, and I think that was represented in the fact that we had such big numbers coming along to the events, people just coming in off the back of invitations and asking loads of questions. And realising for the first time maybe that there are answers to some of the questions too.
And are there big differences between groups of students in those countries and here? I know you get a whole range, don't you, of different places you go to in this country, where some of the responses perhaps are more muted than others, but is there any big difference between those countries and here?
I think sometimes the questions can be different, some of the issues, depending on culture. Some of them are the same. I mean, the questions, like the question of suffering that we look at here, that's kind of universal. I think there's just more of a general kind of interest there because their background is different,
Yeah.
they don't say, well, Christianity is the thing that we've already done. It's just, well, what is it?
Yeah.
And the opportunity to look into it for the first time.
Good, okay. Before you speak, we've got a video, short video. It's a couple of minutes long, isn't it? And what it does, it's like a vox box, which is just the man in the street. What does he think of the Bible? So if we have the video on, that will be a good introduction to Michael's talk. Thank you.
I haven't read the Bible for my own reasons. I've skimmed it.
I have read the Bible. I kind of looked at little segments, but I've never actually attempted to read the whole thing.
It's not advertised enough, like I don't go to church, so the time when I do read it is when I'm in church, but other than that, I don't have a copy of the Bible. Yeah.
They're interesting stories, like as a guide for people how to live, not necessarily taken literally.
I thought it was daunting.
It's been a long time, so I don't really remember everything.
Story of Adam and Eve.
Yeah, Adam and Eve.
Stories about Jesus and his life.
Okay, of course, the Genesis. I don't know the difference between sort of like the different books and stuff. But I do know Genesis is the first one. Or is that an argument? I don't know.
Great, so some very different views about the Bible there. I wonder what yours are. As we go through tonight, as Pete said, there's going to be that number on the screen. So unlike perhaps normally in church, make sure your phone is on and you can text in at any point with your question. And if you're watching this online, then obviously you can text in as well from wherever you are in the world. Just add the 0044 and take off the first 0, and you can get us from anywhere in the world and text your questions, and we will endeavour to answer as many of them at the end as possible. But as we look about the Bible tonight, the Bible is a fascinating and amazing book, isn't it? It's written over 1,500 years by around 40 different authors in very different times and places, in several different languages, and it's the world's best-selling book, available in over 2,200 languages. An incredible book, although as someone said, it's the most sold, but often the least read. Maybe we've all got somewhere a copy of the Bible sitting on a shelf, but actually perhaps we don't always read it. And perhaps one of the reasons why people don't always read it is because, as the title of tonight suggests, we assume the Bible must be just a kind of fairy story. Someone alluded to that on the video. It's a nice story, it's got some nice morals maybe, but it's just a kind of made-up story. And that's certainly what a lot of people might say. Darren Brown, famous for a number of his TV shows, writes this in one of his books. He says, "The evidence shows very clearly that the stories of the New Testament were written in the first couple of 100 years after Jesus died. These stories continue to be edited and revised for political and social needs for the most part of the first millennium. The early Christians needed stories and legends to inspire them and give them credence, so they created them." In other words, the stories, particularly he says of the New Testament, are just invented legends to give some credibility to the Christian movements. Of course, you may remember when the Da Vinci Code came out, that film that caused a lot of controversy because of its views about the Bible. The idea that the Gospels, as we have them today, were later Gospels, and there were other books about Jesus that were suppressed and so forth. And much discussion was had about that. Richard Dawkins says this about the Da Vinci Code, though. He says, "The only difference between the Da Vinci Code and the Gospels is that the Gospels are ancient fiction, while the Da Vinci Code is modern fiction." Okay, he says, we may not take the novel too seriously, but we shouldn't take the Bible too seriously either. And the late Christopher Hitchens said this: "The New Testament is a work of crude carpentry, hammered together long after its purported events, and full of improvised attempts to make things come out right." So he's saying we shouldn't really take it that seriously. And maybe that echoes some of your questions or thoughts about the Bible. I think it's worth saying right at the outset, there are two mistakes you can make with the Bible, okay? The first mistake is often made by Christians, and they say something like this. They say, well, the Bible, it must be true because it's the Bible, okay? It's a religious book, therefore we won't question it. It's just kind of an unquestioning acceptance of its authority. And of course, we can see the problem with that. It's not thought through, it's not questioned, it's not investigated, it's just assumed. The second mistake, though, is made by some other people, and they say something like this: well, the Bible, it can't be true because it's the Bible, and it's a religious text. And it's an unquestioning rejection of the Bible, not because they've necessarily investigated it, just because we assume that a religious text cannot be reliable, cannot be true. And both of those things are a mistake, because they fail to actually investigate it for itself. Now, of course, Christians do talk about the Bible being God's word, being inspired. Some of those things came up in the survey we did as you were coming in. But actually, my intention tonight is not to try and persuade you that the Bible is that. Christians do believe that the Bible is God's word. But actually, if you're investigating this, particularly for the first time, the first question really is to ask this: is the Bible historically reliable? That would be the first question, the immediate question. Can I trust what the Bible says about history, about Jesus in particular? Or is it just a fairy story? And if you can, then maybe it would be more than that, but at least start with that question. And tonight, what I really want to do is focus in our attention on those 4 books that make up the start of the New Testament. We call them the Gospels. Early Christians called them the memoirs of Jesus. But those 4 accounts of Jesus' life. There's a few reasons why I want to do that. Firstly, because the Bible's a big book. It's actually a library of 66 books. It would be impossible for us to investigate the historical reliability of every single part of it. So we're going to focus on those 4. There's a second reason, and that is to focus on those 4, and that is that Jesus really is the center of Christianity. The clue is in the name, isn't it? It's Christianity. And so a good place to start in investigating the Bible would be those 4 books that speak specifically about his life, death, and resurrection. And actually, there's a third reason for starting with the Gospels, and that is Jesus is the character that holds the whole Bible together. The Old Testament looks forward to him. The New Testament, written after him, looks back to him. But he is the central figure. And actually, Jesus himself gives authority to the Old Testament, the bit that was written before him, by quoting from it and treating it as authoritative. And he also commissions the people who are going to write the books after him, those letters that we have later on in the New Testament. And so if you can get the Jesus bit sorted, the other bits kind of fall into place too. So particularly tonight then, we're going to start by looking at the Gospels. And really what I want to do is just ask a series of questions and see what we make of these questions, and then we'll go to your questions. Okay? So here's the first question. Who wrote these accounts, these books, and when? Well, the Gospels were written by different individuals, and they were either eyewitnesses, as in the case of John, who claimed to have been there and seen it, or people who were close to the eyewitnesses, people like Luke, who said, I've interviewed the people who were there and saw it, and carefully investigated it. And they wrote them in the 1st century. We don't know exactly when. They don't come with a date on the top, unfortunately. But we know it must be within the 1st century for a couple of reasons. The first is that we've got copies of the Gospels that date right from the beginning of the 2nd century. I was in Manchester recently, and I was looking at this fragment. It's a fragment of John's Gospel. You can go and see it in the John Rylands Library. It's the earliest fragment we have of any of the New Testament books. Dates from 125 AD approximately. And it's a copy, not the original, of John's Gospel. So the Gospels have been copied and distributed widely within a few years. Couldn't have been written 200 years later. We've got the manuscripts. There's a second reason we know that the Gospels were written in the 1st century, and that is that they're quoted from and alluded to in other books that date from the end of the 1st century. And it would be kind of hard, wouldn't it, to quote a book that hasn't yet been written. So we know that they must have been written before the end of the 1st century. In other words, at a time when the eyewitnesses were still alive. And that's really significant. It would be much easier, wouldn't it, to invent a story, a fictitious story, if it was taking place in an era when all the eyewitnesses have now died. Okay? If we were going to invent a story today, it'd be much easier to invent one that happened in the 19th century or the 18th century than it would be to invent one that happened today. Okay? So that's when they were written. But here's a second question. Couldn't they have forgotten the details if they wrote them later? You see, it seems that the Gospel writers didn't write these stories about Jesus immediately. It might have been 30, 40 or so years after the events when they actually wrote them. Couldn't they have forgotten the details? Because we do forget things, don't we? I can't remember what I had for dinner last Wednesday. I have no idea what it was now. It clearly wasn't very significant. But of course, there are other things that we don't forget. For instance, I can remember what I had for dinner on my first date, aged 14. I remember it was meat feast pizza from Pizza Hut, which was also why it's probably the last date with that particular girl. But it was a significant meal, you see. And so there are some things we forget, some things we remember, depending on what they are. Now, psychologists say there are 3 types of events that we will probably remember more specifically. Events that are unique, unusual, or ones that have an emotional impact upon our lives in a major way. And of course, the stories we read about in the Gospels regarding Jesus would have fitted into all those 3 categories. They're not the kind of thing you would easily forget. You know, you can imagine John sitting there, kind of an old man, thinking, well, now, did Jesus rise from the dead or not? Was the tomb empty or not? They're not the kind of things that you would quickly forget. It's also worth remembering that the first century was very much an oral culture. People didn't necessarily write things down, and they certainly didn't have Google, and so they were much better at remembering things that were spoken to them than we are today. In fact, there are parts of the world today that are still much better at it than the Western world that we live in. And actually, the fact that they might have been written 50, 60 years later isn't that troubling when you consider that, for instance, the first or the earliest surviving written documents about Alexander the Great are from 400 years after his death. So we're talking about a much shorter period. So I think we've got confidence that they would have remembered the details. We'll see more on that later. But here's another question. Weren't they biased? Well, yes. Of course they were. And actually, to discover that, you only need to read them. John says, I'm writing these things so that you might believe that Jesus is God. Or Luke says, I'm writing these things so that you might know the certainty of the things that have been told you about Jesus. So they're quite open that they're writing with a deliberate intention, and they're writing from the conviction that Christianity is true. So they are biased. But then actually think about it. It would be impossible, wouldn't it, to be completely neutral about Jesus? He's not the kind of person that you can be neutral about because of the nature of the claims that he made and the things that he's supposed to have done. So you'll not find a neutral source anywhere. And actually, if you push this a bit further, you won't find any neutral sources about anything in history because they don't exist. Everybody in history writes from a particular standpoint, a particular opinion. But this is the important thing. Just because people might have a conviction or an opinion about something doesn't mean that we should dismiss what they say. And it doesn't mean that we can't find real facts from history. Okay? Imagine 200 years' time, someone is looking through the newspaper records of Britain in the year 2016, in the months of April, May, and June. They will discover a lot of talk, won't they, about this EU referendum, okay? And they will discover some people who very passionately believe that we should leave the EU, and some other people who very passionately believe that we should stay. They'll meet people who have very different opinions. And I hazard a guess that they probably won't find many neutral opinions in the press either. We'll find very strong opinions. Now, that doesn't mean that in 200 years' time, they will say, well, we have no idea what happened. Just because there are different opinions, they can still conclude, well, there must have been a referendum and a vote, and in a few months' time, we'll know what happened. So different opinions doesn't necessarily remove the fact that something happened. What about this, though? Didn't the writers fabricate the stories? Didn't they just make them up? Couldn't they have just invented them for whatever means? And maybe, as Darren Brown said, just to begin this new religion. Well, I guess firstly you'd have to ask the question, if they did, why did they do that? What would be their motive in making up these stories? I think I've said before, we're very good at making up stories when we're children, aren't we? We make up stories to get ourselves out of trouble. we say things like, my sister did it, the dog ate it was on fire when I arrived, those kind of things. And we make up stories to get myself out of trouble, but no one ever makes up a story to get himself into trouble. It's just not something you do. And this is significant because for 300 years, until Constantine declares himself a Christian in the 4th century, for 300 years, Christians are persecuted and marginalized and often killed for their belief in Jesus. So the early Christians had nothing to gain and everything to lose from making up these stories. So you've got to ask, why did they make up these stories? And why did people continue to believe them in the face of such opposition if they were just fabrications? But we could also go beyond that and say, if they did make them up, how would that have worked? And would it have been as easy as we might imagine? Now, there's a guy who's done some work on this called Richard Borkham. He was a professor of New Testament at St Andrews in Scotland, where I was just a few weeks ago. And Richard Borkham's written a big fat book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which is really an investigation into how we can know that the Gospels are reliable eyewitness evidence. And one of the things he looks at is how it would have been very easy, if the stories were simply fabricated, for the writers to get things wrong. Very easy. And yet, so often, they seem to get things right. And one of the things he particularly looks at is the use of names. Now, this might sound a little bit complicated, but bear with me, it's fascinating. One of the things we've discovered in the last few years through various surveys that have been done is the names that people had in first century Palestine. People have dug up bone boxes and census data and stuff like that. And they've worked out what the most popular names were in first century Palestine in the time when Jesus lived. And this is what they were: Simon, Joseph, Lazarus, Judas, and John. Okay? And then what Richard Borkham's done is he's gone through the Gospels and the book of Acts, and he's looked at the names that come up in the Gospels and to see what the popularity of names are as recorded in the Gospels, and says, do they match the popularity of names in that culture? And what he discovered was that the popular names were Simon, Joseph, Judas, John, and Jesus. Kind of similar. In fact, if you start looking at the percentages, it's even more interesting, because he discovered that in first century Palestine, 15.6% had one of the two most popular names, Joseph or Simon. And in the Gospels, 18.2 had one of the two most popular names, Joseph or Simon. And in that culture, 41.5% had one of the 9 most popular names. And 40.3% in the Bible had one of the 9 most popular names. So in other words, what he shows is that the popularity of names as we see them in the Bible matches the popularity of names as you would see them in culture. Now, you're thinking, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, put it like this. If you were going to invent a story, and you were going to invent characters for that story, firstly, would you even think about this being a significant thing? And secondly, even if you did, would you get it right? Could you guess? Well, let's make it easier. I'm not going to get you to guess what the most popular names are in a different country, or even a different era, but what do you think are the most popular names of men of any age, males of any age, in Britain today, okay? So we're not just talking about newborn babies, okay, because that kind of goes in trends, but across the whole population, the male population of Britain, what are the most popular names? Just shout them out. I know this is church, but you're allowed to do that. Okay, what do you think the most popular names are? John, David, Jack, Andrew, sorry, Alan, Steve. So you're all going at once. Okay, this is church. Okay, one at a time. No. Any more? Michael. What was that over there? Sorry? Joshua. Okay, so we've had a few, okay. Let's see what they are, okay, because I decided to work this out. So I went online and I found out that in the UK, the most popular names are John, David, Michael, and Paul, okay? So I think we had 3 of those shouted out amongst the others. But do you reckon you could have got all 4? Well, I don't think anyone got all 4. And do you reckon you could get them in the right order? Actually, it's harder than you think, isn't it? To just guess. You couldn't do it. But then I thought to myself, but if you were writing a story about lots of people who really exist in Britain today, then the popularity of names in that story, if it was a real story about real people, should match the popularity of names in Britain, right? Because it's a real story, not an invented one. And so I thought, where could I find a big list of names that are kind of from a cross-section of ages that live in Britain today? And I thought of the Lansdowne Church Members Book. So this is where I got a little bit geeky. I got the Lansdowne Church Members Book, and I started writing down the names of all the men who come on the membership of this church, and then kind of checking the ones that came up more than once and so on. And I discovered that at Lansdowne Church, the most popular names of men are exactly the same. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because when we tried to guess it, no one got it right. But when I went through some real people who really live, it kind of works. Obviously, the sample is a bit larger than we had in the Gospels, so we might expect a stronger correlation. But that's interesting. I got really geeky at this point, because I thought, let's see if this goes. So I got my calculator out, and I worked out what the most popular names were in Britain and the percentages. And this is what we had. So 9, 9, 6, and 5% are the most popular names in the UK today. And at Lansdowne, 11, 9, 7, and 4. Do you see the point? What was impossible to guess, you kind of get right when you're writing about real people. And what Richard Borkham is saying is that this is the kind of thing that they could have easily got wrong. Remember, they can't just go on Google and work out what the most popular names are. But if you're writing a real story about really real people, then it kind of works. Now, why is that significant? Let's think about something else. Think of, for a minute, the last film that you watched, okay? Now, if you're not into watching films, that might be quite hard, because it might have been years ago, but think of the last film that you watched. I won't get you to shout this out, but how many of the characters' names can you remember? I'm not talking about the actors, okay, but the characters' names as they are in the film. Okay, if it's Superman, it's probably a bit easy, but you get one at least, or two. But actually, it's hard, isn't it? Because you forget the names. They're the first things to go. And yet, I bet you could tell me a pretty good outline of the story. In fact, you could probably tell me lots of things that went on in that story. The first thing you forget is the names. That's important, because if it means this, if the gospel writers got the details that are most easy to forget right, maybe they got the other details right too. If the things that would have gone first were right, then maybe they were right in this. That's just one example. We could look at others, but we haven't got time. But what Richard Borkham does, he says, look, in all these different areas, they could have easily got it wrong, but they got it right. They get customs and cultures right. They get geographical places right, details of how to get from places to other places. They even know the flora and fauna that are particularly unique to that part of the world that you wouldn't have known if you lived somewhere else, and so on. It would have been very hard to fabricate the stories and make them sound so reliable. That, of course, doesn't prove that the Bible is true. But I often come across this kind of objection to the Bible. Well, it was written by kind of thickos that didn't really know what they were doing. And the one thing you cannot say is that they were thick. They were either producing the most brilliant forgeries and fabrications that history has known, or, of course, they might have just been ordinary people writing about things that they saw and experienced. So I don't think they fabricated the stories. But you might also say this: why aren't there more sources, particularly about Jesus? Because if Jesus is such a significant character, why are we confined to just 4 accounts about his life? Well, I guess the first thing to say is there are other sources about Jesus, and sources outside of Christian history too. And in fact, if you even discounted the entire Bible, you could still discover a number of things about Jesus. You would know where he was from, that he existed, that he gathered a great following, that he was known for doing remarkable deeds, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And yet, in spite of that fact, the movement of his followers spread right across the world to Rome within 20 years. All of that you could discover without even opening the Bible, just other historical sources, things like Josephus, a Jewish historian, Tacitus, a Roman historian, and so on. But you might say, well, why aren't there more sources? Why don't we have loads of people from the first century writing about Jesus? Well, one thing to say is there might have been. There may well have been, because we don't have every source that was written from the first century still today. I'll give you one example, Suetonius, a historian from the first century. We know from records that he wrote at least 17 different works, okay? But 13 of them are no longer available to us. They've been lost. We just know the names of them. 3 of them have remained in kind of partial form. We have bits of them. And only one of them survives in full. And interestingly, that one does mention Jesus. And so there may well have been other people writing things about Jesus. We just don't have every document from the first century. Of course, there might have been reasons as well why people wouldn't want to talk about Jesus. You know, just as the gospel writers wanted everyone to know about Jesus, if you were very closely connected to the Jewish and Roman authorities that had caused him to be crucified, you would have reasons not to want to talk about him, maybe at the same kind of level. And the events that happened in the Gospels generally didn't happen in Jerusalem, the capital city of Palestine. They happened in Galilee, the kind of northern region. It's a bit like events happening maybe the Hebrides rather than London, kind of things that wouldn't get so easily reported in the other kind of writings. But in particular, and this is interesting, what we don't have is any source, contemporary source in the first century, that gives us an alternative explanation for who Jesus really was. And that's important. Because imagine I was going to write a story, okay? And I'm going to write a story about Pete Brown, because you've all met him. He was the guy at the beginning. And so I'm going to write a story about Pete, and I'm going to say, Pete Brown is an amazing guy. And he not only can run 10 kilometers, as he did earlier today, he can not only cycle bikes very fast, but actually Pete is God. And Pete can do amazing things. Some people swim between the piers at Bournemouth, but Pete is seen walking across Bournemouth, Poole Bay, as it is. And when people are ill, Pete just goes around and waves his snotty handkerchief over their face, and they get better, whatever illness they have. And the other day, he walked into a crowded room and pulled out his packed lunch, and he fed everybody with his sarnies. And I write this story, and for some amazing reason, the Daily Echo decide to publish it. And for some even more amazing reason, people start to read it. Now, 2 questions. Firstly, is anyone going to believe my story? Of course not. Because lots of people in Bournemouth know Pete. And they know he's a great guy, and he can run 10 kilometres, and he can cycle even further, but he's not God, and he can't do those other things. And if people did start believing that, you can imagine someone might write into the Echo and say, well, hang on a minute, this isn't true. This is the truth, okay? Now, why is that significant? The Gospels, as we said earlier, were written and distributed and believed within the first century, at a time when the eyewitnesses were still alive. So if they made up these incredible stories about Jesus, why did people believe them? Because they could have checked out the evidence. And why didn't people put them right? Because they could have done, couldn't they, if these stories were just invented? What about this, though? You might say, well, you can't verify all the stories that we find in the Bible. We can't check everything out and kind of look at it in other kind of historical documents. Josephus doesn't tell us all the details about Jesus' life and so forth. Well, that's true, okay? You can't objectively investigate every claim that the Gospels make. The virgin birth. I'm not sure how you would do that anyway, but we can't do that for every claim. But we can for some. And therefore, if where we can check the Bible it's found to be reliable, surely the better assumption is where we can't check it, it might be reliable too, rather than immediately dismissing it. Because that's not really how we work in life, is it? I mean, sorry to pick on Pete again, but he's the one guy at least you all know. Imagine Pete is sitting at home tomorrow, and Gaynor, his wife, comes back, and Pete says to Gaynor, where have you been? And Gaynor says, well, I've just been out for coffee with a friend. And Pete says, prove it. And Gaynor says, sorry. And he says, prove it. How do I know you really went out for a coffee with your friends? How do I know you weren't doing something else? I want to see a receipt from Costa. I want to see some CCTV footage of you actually in the coffee shop drinking the coffee. Well, if he did say that, you'd kind of have a few worries about his marriage, wouldn't you? Because that's not how people work. Why? Because Pete knows that he can trust his wife because in lots of ways he's found her trustworthy. And so he doesn't always ask for verification of everything because he knows that generally she tells the truth. And so as we look at the Bible, we can see lots of ways that it generally tells us the truth wherever we can check it. And therefore, wouldn't it be safer to maybe trust it in the areas where we can't always yet verify it by secondary sources? And in fact, if you were to disbelieve everything in history that wasn't backed up by a secondary external source, the amount of stuff you could know about history would be very limited indeed, and rather boring. But what about this? One last question. If not, then what? What do I mean by that? If we're going to say about the Bible, well, it is just a fabricated story, there's a few problems. Firstly, what was the cause of this explosion 2,000 years ago that has been rippling through history ever since and started the biggest sociological phenomenon ever, the church, who a third of the world's population now claim to be part of in some form? What was it that started that, if it wasn't Jesus doing something pretty significant? And why did these people in the first century, who were so strict and monotheistic in their Jewish religion, in such big numbers decide to start following this man who had been crucified? Why on earth did they so radically change their opinion about life and the universe and everything and God? And why were they willing to die for it for 300 years? And who was responsible for this teaching that has radically transformed history? Who was responsible for the most amazing teaching the world's ever heard? And then how come they were so incredibly humble that they were willing for someone else's name to be put to it rather than their own? If you're going to dismiss the Bible, what other alternative will you come up with? Well, we're nearly through to questions from you, but let me just give you two illustrations before we finish. Because you might be saying, well, this is all very interesting, but I'm not particularly into history, and all of this stuff just seems a little bit kind of irrelevant to my life. Fascinating maybe, but irrelevant. Let me give you an illustration. When I go flying, as I will be tomorrow morning out to Serbia, you get to the airport, and provided you're not flying with Ryanair or one of those cheaper airlines that give you cattle class, if you go kind of with a kind of more reputable airline, you basically get the choice, don't you, of sitting by the window or the aisle. Yeah? Window or aisle, they ask you, and if you're really late, it's just middle seat. But when they ask that question, I always say window. For two reasons. Firstly, because I don't have to keep getting up when other people need the toilet. So that's useful. But secondly, because I love windows. Don't you? I mean, look at that window there. It's so aesthetically pleasing. I mean, it's not quite rectangular. It's not quite oval or circular. I'm not sure what shape it's meant to be. It's not only double glazed, but it's triple glazed. It's incredible. Well, actually, I have to give a confession here. I'm not really fascinated about windows at all. The reason why I really like sitting by a window is because you can see through it, right? And once you've left the British Isles, you can normally see something other than clouds as well. The purpose of a window is to see through it, to see what's on the other side. The purpose of the Bible and the Gospels are also in a similar way like a window. They're for us to see Jesus. Christianity is not just about a book, it's about a person. But we discover the person through the book, just as you can see a view through a window. Now, of course, if the window is broken or damaged or even closed, you're not going to see much on the other side. That's why it's important to know whether the Bible is reliable. Can we see history accurately through it? But you don't just look at the window, you look through it. And the purpose of the Bible is for us to see the other side of it, to Jesus, the real Jesus of history, the Jesus that split history in two, the Jesus that made the most incredible claims that anyone has ever made, the Jesus who claims to bring God into human focus and offer us life now and life beyond the grave. So don't just study the Bible, but through the Bible, look at the person of Jesus. A second illustration, and then we'll go to your questions. Imagine you're walking down the road later on, and as you walk down the road, you see this. You see a National Lottery scratch card. And you bend down and you notice that the scratch card hasn't actually been scratched. You pick it up and you look around, and because you're a law-abiding citizen, you try to see if anyone might have dropped it, but there's no one around whatsoever, and so you're left holding the scratch card. It's only worth £1, so you think, well, it's not really worth taking to the police station. What would you do? Well, I would scratch it. I don't know about you. Now, what is the chance that you're going to win £100,000 from that scratch card? I don't know, but I'm guessing it's less than 1 in 100,000, okay? My maths tells me that Camelot would have gone bust if that was their kind of way of working. So the chances of you winning something significant is very, very small, but you still scratch it. Because it might be valuable. In the same way, even if there was a chance, just a small chance that the Bible was true, wouldn't it be worth looking at it? Because if it is, the implications are huge. It tells us that there is a God who's made himself known. There is a God who we can know personally. There is life beyond this life. And there is certainty for those who come to know Jesus. So even if at the end of what I've said so far, you're saying, well, I'm completely unconvinced and I don't yet think this is true, even if there was a chance, it might be. Wouldn't it be worth investigating? So we're going to have a pause in a moment, but can I just at this point say, if you've not yet, why not, as an adult, read through one of those accounts of Jesus' life? This is going to be on the book table through next door. This is absolutely free. This is Luke's accounts of Jesus' life. And my encouragement and challenge to you would be to read it. Just to go through it. Take you a couple of hours, 2 or 3 at most. But say, well, if this was true, what's it all about? I have to say it's a risky book to read, because many people have read that book, convinced that it isn't true, and convinced that it's irrelevant, and have come to very different conclusions at the end. So I warn you, it might be a challenging book, but I dare you to read it anyway and see what you think for yourself, okay? But let's take a break, because I've spoken for long enough. Chat to the people around you. Why not do that for a couple of minutes while we have some more music? And text in or write down or make a mental note of the questions that you want to ask. And then in a couple of minutes, we're going to be back to go through those questions, okay? So you can discuss that with the person next to you. Maybe you had questions about other parts of the Bible that we haven't touched on. That's fine. We focus particularly on the Gospels, but your questions can relate to other parts of it too. And we'll come back in a few minutes. Go for it.
could I just say now, if any of you have got questions that you've got written on the feedback forms, if you'd like to just raise them, and the stewards will just pick those up from you now. That's fine. Be 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll start the questions. So just keep them raised. Thank you. You're out. Okay, thank you for all the questions. Actually, we've probably had more tonight than we've had on any previous evening. So coupled with, we'll try and get through them as quickly as we possibly can, but meaningfully as well. So if we start off, first question is, Michael said, if the Bible writers were biased, how can the Bible be flawless?
Okay. I guess partly it depends what you mean by biased. I guess what people say is they want a neutral source, as in someone who was kind of neutral about Jesus. They didn't have a particular opinion about him. They just wrote from a completely neutral standpoint. And what I'm trying to say is that's actually impossible. People ultimately have a conviction one way or the other about Jesus and who he was. And so I wouldn't say it's a flaw to the Bible or a bad thing about the Bible that the Bible writers are writing from a conviction that he was the Son of God. Actually, if they weren't convinced that Jesus is the Son of God, that would be a bit troubling, wouldn't it? Because you'd be saying, well, if they're not convinced, then there's no way I'm going to be. So I think I wouldn't say it's a flaw to the Bible. I'd just say, so bias in that sense is just saying they had a conviction, an opinion about what had happened.
Yeah.
And they then backed that up with evidence. Yeah.
And in their own style as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So second question, how do we know which parts of the Bible we should look to verify and which parts we should simply trust?
Yeah, great question. So which bits do we need to verify? Which bits do we need to trust? I guess there's two ways you could answer it. Firstly, you could say, well, what is the foundation of Christianity? You know, what do Christians, and what did the early Christians say is the most important thing? And it helpfully tells us that in the Bible. So if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, written about AD 52 or 53, we find there Paul saying the things that are first importance are that Jesus died and that he rose again. So Jesus' death and resurrection are the real heart and center of the Christian faith. And so I would say that's a key place to start, Jesus' death and his resurrection. And the helpful thing is actually when we're looking at those two claims, we can really objectively look at a great weight and massive evidence We looked at the resurrection last time, so if you go online, you can hopefully check out the evidence for that. So we can look at what the Bible says is the heart and the foundation. The other way of looking at it is simply to say, where can we verify the Bible? Where do we find external sources that will back up or confirm what the Bible tells us? And that's obviously dictated by what we have. And that could be all sorts of things. So in the Old Testament particularly, we've got lots of archaeological discoveries that confirm the kings of certain times in history from the nation of Israel and other nations around them, certain events that happened. You can see a whole mural on the wall of the British Museum depicting one of the events recorded in the book of Isaiah and so forth. So in one sense, we just say, well, what do we have? And we look at what we have. And as I said, there may well be more. We do not have everything that could be dug up from history, and certainly not everything that could be dug up from somewhere like Jerusalem, because people live there. You can't just go in and say, can we dig up your house because there might be something of value underneath.
But isn't it true that every archaeological dig there's nothing that's ever disproved a part of the Bible?
Yeah, I think there's sometimes been things that have caused us to ask questions, and we say, well, how does that fit? And sometimes we say, well, we don't have all the details here, but there's been nothing that's completely shown us that the Bible's been untrue. In fact, quite the opposite. Again and again, we find that archaeological discoveries confirm, and even sometimes sort out issues that we had, or things that we didn't understand. Can I give you one example quickly? This is one of my favorites in the Old Testament. So in the book of Daniel, we read about this king called Belshazzar. He's the guy that dies because of the writing on the wall. You remember the story? And it says, you've been weighed in the balance and found wanting, and so forth. And Daniel is offered the third highest place in the kingdom if he can interpret the writing on the wall. A lot of people said this is clearly fictitious because there's no record of a king called Belshazzar in the records of Babylon, and we know the last king of Babylon was called Nabonidus, and therefore this is clearly showing that Daniel was made up much later, and so forth. Until they discovered a cylinder, and you can see it in the British Museum, called the Nabonidus cylinder, which details certain things about Nabonidus' reign, including the fact that he had a son called Belshazzar, who acted as the king in his place when he was out of town or fighting battles or whatever he was doing. And so that shows us that there was a kind of king called Belshazzar. It also shows us why he never became king, because Nabonidus was the last king and then the kingdom kind of came to an end, so it kind of succeeded his father. And interestingly, it shows us why Daniel was offered the third highest part of the kingdom, not the second, which you would imagine would happen if you were the king, because he was really only the second, and so he gave Daniel the third. So that's just one example of people saying, well, the Bible doesn't fit with history, and then we discover more about history, and we discover, oh, actually it does, far more fascinatingly and perfectly than we could imagine.
Yeah, and it almost reaffirms the Bible even more forcefully when it's discovered.
Yeah, and obviously we can't dig up something for every part of the Bible, but when you see things like that, it kind of increases your confidence. So, hey, this does seem to work, yeah.
Great, okay, thank you. Have we got any questions from yourselves? Anybody want to ask anything with a roving mic? No? Should we crack on?
One at the back.
Oh, we've got one here. Excellent, thank you.
The world was flat.
Sorry?
Did they believe the earth was flat in those days?
Was there
Did they believe the earth was flat?
Oh, did they believe the earth was flat
In those days,
in the time of the Bible? Yeah, that's a fascinating question, because some people say, well, the Bible says the world was flat, and certainly some people through history who believed the world was flat tried to kind of proof text from the Bible the fact that the world was flat. But actually, I think what they were doing was twisting what the Bible says to try and confirm what they already believed about the world. And interestingly, if you want to do that, you could look at other verses from the Bible. God sits above the circle of the earth, it says, I think in the Psalms. So that could allude to quite the opposite.
Yeah.
I think the reality is the Bible doesn't, I don't think, speak specifically about the shape of the earth. And therefore, I don't think we can say that the Bible writers thought the world was flat. No. But thanks for the question.
Great. Okay. Next one. Isn't it true that the earliest discovered Hebrew scriptures date back from the exile and that they're just a mishmash of Persian and Egyptian stories?
So are the Hebrew scriptures just dating back to the exile If you're not sure what the exile is, basically if you go back through the story of the Old Testament, and we see the nation of Israel at around the 7th century BC and the 9th century BC, the northern and the southern part of the nation of Israel got taken off into exile, first to Assyria and then to Babylon. And people suggest that, well, really what we have about Israel really dates from around that time. And all the kind of preceding stories were really invented stories that were made up to kind of give credibility to the Israelite nation. What do I make of that? Well, you probably guess I don't think that's the case. For a couple of reasons. One, the further back we go in history, whatever history we're looking at, you're not going to have quite so much stuff. So the more recent history you get, the more we have. And so, yeah, if you go to the British Museum, yes, there is more kind of external stuff for bits of the Bible from the exile onwards, but that would be the case for anything in history. We just have less the further back we go. I think it's also worth saying that absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So when people say things like, there is no evidence outside of the Bible for, say, the Exodus, therefore it didn't happen, we have to say, well, by the way, that's a big kind of complicated question whether there is or isn't, and it's confusing maybe to go into in detail now. But just because it might not be spoken about in Egyptian records doesn't mean it didn't happen. And actually, you want to say there might be some good reasons why they didn't want to talk about it. I think sometimes the reason why we try and kind of put all of the Old Testament from kind of the later part of the nation of Israel's time is that it starts with the presupposition that there isn't a God. I'll give you one example. A lot of people say the book of Daniel must have been written much later because the book of Daniel contains lots of prophecies that detail things that were going to happen in the future. And people say, well, there isn't a God, therefore the book of Daniel must have been written after those events because prophecy cannot happen, okay? So actually the reason for suggesting that it must have been written later was not that the text actually leads them to that conclusion, but their conviction that there isn't a God, therefore prophecy can't happen. Actually, the thing I mentioned earlier about Belshazzar and Nabonidus and so on gives us a very strong reason to think actually Daniel did write it at the time and knew about what was going on. So I think sometimes these convictions come from later on. It's worth saying our manuscript copies may come from later on, but just because your copy of a document comes from later on doesn't mean the document itself comes from earlier on. One other thing, sorry, there's lots of things I could say on this. People might say something like, well, what about the floods? Because we've got Babylonian stories about a flood and other stories, and the Bible is just rehashing them. Well, actually think about it. If there really was a flood, you might expect there to be echoes of that story in cultures other than the Christian or the Jewish culture. And so the fact that we find some echoes of some biblical stories in other cultures doesn't necessarily mean they're not true. Actually, it may well show that they really are true.
Yeah,
Okay?
so instead of coming from other cultures, it could actually be feeding out to the other cultures as well.
Yeah.
The stories. Okay.
Sorry, that was a long answer. I'll be trying quicker on
It
that
was a
one.
long
Yeah,
answer,
sorry.
but we'll crack on. How do we know that the Old Testament is reliable? The Quran shares stories with the Old Testament, yet they're different in places. How do we know that they've not become corrupted through oral tradition?
Great.
Can I? Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
I've got a note.
Okay.
Can I include the next question with this one, Gareth? Accepting all you've said about the Bible, could it not apply to the Quran as well?
Okay. I'll take the first one first and then the second one second. Because that seems like a good order to do it in. Firstly, the Quran does mention some stories from the Old Testament, and sometimes when it reports those stories, they get some of the bits the same and some of the bits different, okay? I would probably be, well, you might imagine I want to go with the Old Testament over the Quran, not just because I'm a Christian, but also because the manuscripts of the Old Testament books would predate the Quran. So I think if you're looking at which one is the earliest, I go back to the earliest manuscripts, and we've got manuscripts of Old Testament books that are around way before the Quran.
Do we know how long?
How long a gap? Well, if you're looking at the 7th century for the rise of Islam, we're looking at from around, it depends which books you're looking at. Isaiah was from just in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a full copy of Isaiah from just before the time of Jesus, so 600 years earlier.
Yeah, yeah.
So a significantly earlier period. So I'd say that'd be a good reason to go for the Old Testament. And actually, with the Old Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a fascinating thing to be said, because up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest copy we had of Isaiah, which was written about 700 BC, was from about at least 700 years after Christ. So we're talking about a big kind of period of time. 300 years after, so 1,000 years from when it was written to when it was our earliest copy. When they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found a manuscript that was hundreds of years older than our earliest copy. And what they discovered was, although there might have been some grammatical spelling errors, on the whole, this book had been really accurately preserved. And that was able to show that actually the way that Old Testament manuscripts were passed down was very meticulous and very reliable.
Yeah.
So I think that gives us a lot of confidence to think what we've got in the Old Testament has been reliably passed on. Which leads to the other bit, about could we not apply all of this to the Quran? Well, actually, when you're looking at the Quran, you might say, well, yes, that's a holy book, the Bible's a holy book, but if you actually read them, we're talking about very different things. The Quran, Muslims believe, was revealed to Muhammad from Allah in a cave and then transmitted through him to others and then written down. And so it wasn't, and it isn't, primarily a kind of description of events and history. You really want to go to the Hadith to find out the history of Islam. But the Quran is very much kind of, we might say as Christians, thus saith the Lord, direct kind of God's voice to us. And actually, that is something that's quite hard to objectively investigate. No one else was there in the cave. No one else could actually check it out. So you can say, well, I believe it's true, or I don't. But you can't actually check it in the same way by other history. With the Gospels, you are talking about books that were written publicly about public events that people would have seen. And therefore, you can investigate them and check them in a very different way to the way you would with the Quran. Actually seeing whether this really did happen. I'm not, by the way, denying that there is a historical basis to the growth of Islam, but the kind of supernatural beginnings of Christianity, particularly the resurrection, is something that is very objective and public and something you can look into. It's not just a question of blind faith.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's helpful. Thank you for that. How do we explain things such as Noah's Ark or Adam and Eve, or talking snakes and donkeys? Why is there no mention of dinosaurs in the Bible?
Wow, gosh.
Hold on a minute, there's a whole load over there. No, that's it.
When I first came to be a minister at this church, my previous minister from back in my home church in Leicester, I grew up, wrote a letter, because he couldn't be there, and he said, remind him often that God can speak through a donkey, so don't get big-headed. And so that's a good thing for a preacher to remember, isn't it? And that's a story we read about a guy called Balaam and his donkey in the Old Testament. I guess a general question is, often we dismiss the Bible immediately because it describes supernatural events, miracles, things that aren't normal, that cannot be explained simply in a naturalistic worldview. And if you're going to dismiss the Bible on that basis, you're going to dismiss a lot of it. But actually, that's not a very scientific way of going into any investigation. A scientist might come to an investigation with his initial theory and idea about what he thinks is going to happen. But then you've got to actually look at the evidence. And if the evidence points in a different direction, you have to change your initial theory, your initial hypothesis. So you might come to the Bible saying, well, I don't think miracles can happen, and I assume it's not true. But actually, then you have to say, but putting that on one side for a second, let's see if there's any evidence for this. And particularly with Jesus, we can objectively get stuck into the evidence for his life, death, and resurrection, which is, as we saw last month, really persuasive. And if the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is persuasive, you've got to say, well, okay, maybe miracles can happen, and maybe there is a God, and therefore maybe I shouldn't dismiss all of that miraculous stuff in the Bible. And if there's a God who can raise Jesus from the dead, he can do a lot of other stuff too. So I would say, start with Jesus, start with the resurrection. If that happened and you can investigate that, there's no reason why God couldn't have done some of the other things too. Okay? Not that we can investigate them all in the same way, or with the same kind of objectivity that we could with the resurrection, because they wouldn't have necessarily so many other sources, but we can. Interestingly, things like the floods, there's lots of evidence to suggest that at least there was a cataclysmic flood at some point in history in that region of the world. So we're not talking about something that's just completely ridiculous there. And we can't necessarily verify every Old Testament claim, but there are plenty that we can.
And then questions of like dinosaurs and one came out today that I was chatting with somebody who said about Neanderthal man. You know, where does Neanderthal man fit in with the Bible?
Yeah.
And there are lots of these questions that are thrown in, aren't there?
Partly I'd say there are loads of things that aren't in the Bible. You know, I'm not in the Bible, you're not in the Bible. It doesn't mean we don't exist. It's just that the Bible doesn't tell us everything that's ever happened in history. It's telling us the stuff that we need to know about history and our place in it. And I think that's the helpful thing to bear in mind. It's not trying to give us everything that's ever happened everywhere in the world.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. If Christianity was in the 1st century, why is Buddhism older?
Because it was.
And is that possible? I guess the question is saying...
I guess the assumption is, you know, is the oldest the best? And actually we want to say, well, no, that's not the only thing you'd want to bear in mind, is it? How old something is. It's interesting, actually, in the 1st century, the objection people had to Christianity was often that it was so new. And in the 21st century in the West, the objection most people have to Christianity is it's so old. But actually, both of them are bad objections. The question is it true? And again, the difference with Jesus is that you can objectively investigate it. The difficulty with Buddhism is it's based on a philosophy, not really an event. And so, whilst you might say it works for me or it doesn't, you can't investigate it objectively in the way you could with the person of Jesus and the resurrection.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'm conscious we've got a couple of questions left. Is there any other questions that you want to ask? Tom's there with the microphone. Is there any other? No? We'll finish off with the last couple then.
Okay.
So, first one, doesn't the Bible support things like slavery, sexism, and homophobia?
Gosh, I would say they are huge topics for probably 3 more big questions next year. So I'm not even going to begin to try to answer all of those questions now. What I would say is on the book table outside, there are a number of books. My book, What Kind of God, is really trying to deal with some of the moral objections. Because really, there are 2 kind of objections you can have to Christianity. Is the Bible true is one of them. The other one is the Bible good? And someone said recently, the philosophy of new atheism is we don't believe in God and we hate him. It's kind of an intellectual and a moral objection. And that's the objections people have. It's the kind of, you know, does it support slavery? Isn't it homophobic, etc. I think my short answer would be no. Jesus says, love your neighbour. He doesn't say, love your neighbour if they're straight and in a committed long-term marriage relationship. No, love your neighbour.
Yeah.
And so, whatever the Bible says about God's blueprint for sexuality, I think we have to say God's command is we love people, whoever they are, and whatever their background is. And that's non-negotiable, absolutely. And the people like Westboro Baptist Church in America, who are often kind of put forward as examples of Christianity, do not represent the Bible and do not represent Christianity. And in fact, do not represent even, you know, the kind of normative viewpoint in America. They're a tiny group that get far too much press coverage for what they are. About slavery, again, we could probably look at that for a whole separate session. I think the difficulty with slavery is that when we read the word slave in the Bible, we immediately think of the slave trade as we saw kind of in the African slave trade. And so we immediately kind of put that back into the Bible. And I think actually you've got to actually look what's going on here. In the New Testament, they couldn't abolish slavery. They didn't have democracy. And actually there was a law that said you couldn't get rid of your slaves, all of them. So it was impossible even for Christians to get rid of their slaves. Yeah. It would have been illegal. And in the Old Testament, I think what you've got is far more of a kind of social welfare system where you had people who came into great debt, could sell their future labour in return for protection, in return for accommodation, food, and so forth. And there were strict rules governing how you did it, that you couldn't beat them, you couldn't steal them, and everything else. So something very different to what we're looking at.
But I think that does give us some alternative subjects for big questions, because it's an opportunity to really give a broader context that those questions are in. So that's something we can consider, certainly. Okay, so coming to the last question, how would I make the Bible more easy to read?
How would you make the Bible more easy to read? I was chatting to a friend recently, and she said, I've been trying to read the Bible, but I find it so hard. And I said, well, where did you start? She said, well, Genesis was fun, but then I kind of got to Leviticus and it got difficult. And I said, well, you don't necessarily have to read it in the order of the books in the Bible. I would actually suggest, if you're going to start with one of the Gospels. Because, as I said, Jesus is the linchpin that holds the whole thing together. He's the foundation. And then from Jesus, then you'll start to see how the bit before him, the Old Testament, makes sense in light of him and so forth. So start with Jesus. The other thing I asked her, I said, which translation are you reading? And she was reading from the King James Version with all the these and the thous and the so forth. And I said, well, it wasn't actually written with these and thous. That was a translation 400 years ago. It was written in Greek, but thankfully people have translated it, or Hebrew for the Old Testament. And so I would say also read a contemporary version of the Bible. Yeah. That's helpful. Yeah. And as I said, we've got copies of Luke's Gospel you can take away and read that in a contemporary English version. The other thing I suggest is, as you read the Bible, talk to people about what you're reading. And rather than kind of reading it in isolation, there's no suggestion in the Bible that that's how we have to do it. In fact, it seems that early Christians would have read and studied the Bible in groups. And so I would say a great way to do it is read through a book like this, but then make notes about things you don't understand or write down your questions of things that come up. And then meet up with a Christian friend and discuss it and say, how do we make sense of this? We've also got a really cool thing called Uncover, which is basically 6 sets of discussion questions based on Luke. And it's the kind of thing you could do over a coffee with a Christian friend. And that helps you kind of think about the kind of questions you might want to ask about it.
And there are great books that go alongside some of the Gospels or other books of the Bible that can really open up. I mean, I've read one recently after being a Christian for many years, and it just comes afresh.
Yeah.
So that's great. Those are all the questions. You're just going to do
a couple of notices, yeah. Just to say, if you are here tonight and you want to find out more, there's a few things you could do. As Pete said, this is, I think, the 7th big questions we've done. And the next big questions, in a month's time, we're going to be looking at the question of why would a God of love send people to hell? So a really kind of one of the moral objections, but a huge emotional issue for many people, whether they're Christian or not. So that's next month, same format, same place, same time. But much sooner than that, tomorrow we're starting the next Alpha course. And people all over the world have done the Alpha course and found it a really helpful way of investigating Christianity for themselves. It's really informal, it's really easy to kind of come into. It's happening right here, well, not right here, but in the hall where you had the cakes earlier on. And it starts at 7:30 tomorrow evening. And we'd love you to come. Why not come with the person you came with tonight if you've come together? And check it out. There's no requirement that you have to come back for the future weeks. You can just kind of come for the taster evening, see what it's like. But basically what you'll get is a short kind of presentation, shorter than tonight, and then the opportunity to discuss in a small group through some of the kind of core issues of the Christian faith to get you started. We'd love you to come to that. So that starts tomorrow. So whatever you were going to do tomorrow night, don't. Come to Alpha instead, because it'll be better.
And great food as well. The meals
and there's going to be fantastic food.
Yeah.
So if alone you came for the food, it'd be worth it, but there's far more than food. But come, 7:30 tomorrow. And the last thing to say, if you want to find out more, do leave us your details on the feedback forms here, and leave us your comments. I know many of us have been to more than one, but it really does help us to know what you think about tonight. So do write down your thoughts on that slip. And then you can pop them in the box where Steve is as you head out later. And if you want to find out more, get in touch with people, discover further, leave your name and number.
And also, if people have other issues that they think would be good to discuss on a Big Questions evening, it's just to pop it down.
Absolutely.
And we can see whether we can then incorporate that into the future evenings.
Brilliant.
Okay, so thank you, Michael, and it's never easy to be put on the spot with immediate questions coming through, a lot of them tonight, but it's really to say, thank you for coming along this evening. Hope you've enjoyed it, hope you found it challenging. If you've come with somebody else, that you've come with, talk to them, talk to myself, Michael, any of the stewards with the Big Questions badges, lanyards on, and And certainly, as Michael said, the Alpha course, what is often the way is when Alpha finishes, the people who've come on that often say to Gaynor, my wife, who's involved with it, I really miss it. When's it starting again? So there'll be a lot of happy people coming tomorrow evening when it restarts. So that's all for this evening. There's more cake, more tea and coffee in the back room. But thank you again, and we'll hopefully see you again. Thank you.